Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, bienvenue. We will go ahead and get started. Welcome to the last session of our 2021 annual conference. We will have two presentations this afternoon. We've had some wonderful presentations this week, and I hope you're looking forward to this afternoon's talks as much as I am. I'm Will Thompson, Vice President of the Center for French Colonial Studies and the coordinator of this year's conference. As was the case for our previous sessions, our format for today is to have each speaker present for approximately 45 to 50 minutes. We certainly welcome any questions or comments you might have, which you can enter in the chat feature at any time during the presentation. So if somebody says something that you have a question about, go ahead, enter your question so you don't forget it. I'll keep track of these and we'll share them with our speakers at the end of each presentation. We'll take a short break of a few minutes between the end of the discussion period for our first speaker and the beginning of our presentation for the second. So I'm pleased to introduce the first of our two speakers this afternoon. Mark Walczynski is park historian for the Starved Rock Foundation, located at Starved Rock State Park in Utica, Illinois. He has written several books about the Franco-Native American history of the Illinois country and Western Great Lakes region, including The History of Starved Rock, 1673 to 1911, Inquietus, LaSalle in the Illinois country, and Massacre 1769, The Search for the Origin of the Legend of Starved Rock. The latter two published by the Center for French Colonial Studies. His articles have appeared in our publication, Le Journal, Michigan's Habitat and Heritage, the Journal of the Illinois State Historical Society, and American Heritage. He is retired from the Illinois Department of Natural Resources, and he serves on our board of directors. The title of his presentation today is Problems Associated with Franklin's 1684 Map of Louisiana, LaSalle's Indian Colony in the Illinois country. Mark.
Okay, thank you, Will. Thank you for the fantastic introduction. Thanks to everybody for tuning in today with such a beautiful fall day. At least it is here in the Illinois country, just one of the days you associate with the perfect fall weather. So as Will said, this presentation is about problems associated with Franklin's 1684 map of Louisiana, and it has to do with Robert Cavelier, LaSalle's so-called Indian colony in the Illinois country. And I go into more detail on this and the background in Inquietus, LaSalle in the Illinois country. So if you're interested, it'd be a good read for you. This is the map we're talking about, the Carte de Louisiane, and we're going to be discussing the area that's inside that red circle. So if we look inside that red circle, we can see with this map, 1684 map, how it depicts today's state of Illinois. We have to look at the background of the situation before we even get to the map, okay? Robert Cavelier. To understand the significance of the problems with the map, it's necessary to understand a bit about LaSalle's education and his background, okay? He was born in Rouen, France in 1643. He received a Jesuit education, entered the Society of Jesus, known as the Jesuits. And with the Jesuits, he studied philosophy, which at the time included logic, physics, metaphysics, and mathematics, which at the time included geography, astronomy, hydrography, the use of globes and a quadrant, and even astrology. The astrology was not like astrology today, where you're going to meet somebody tomorrow and win $1 million or something like that. It was just basically tracking celestial objects and things like that. And in the typical Jesuit education, these hard sciences, as we can call them, I guess, came first. The deep theological things that the Jesuit missionary, a future missionary, we learned usually came later in your education. For example, Fathers Marquette and Nicholas, they didn't even have their they didn't even complete their theological studies before they came to Canada. These Jesuits were also, some of them were cartographers, map makers, they were linguists, they were mathematicians. Some of these are some very, very talented individuals. As a matter of fact, their schools were among the finest schools in Europe at the time. And they essentially taught cutting edge sciences and mathematics, but keep in mind, that's as much as the Roman Church would agree with and allow as well. In fact, the nobility of France sent their children to these Jesuit schools. Why would they send them to Jesuit school? Because not only are a great school, but these young men or their children would grow up to be diplomats. They would serve in the French court. They would be admirals. They would be generals. These people needed to know how things worked. They needed to get a good education from one of the best schools around. So that's why they were sent there. In fact, Cavelier himself was an intelligent guy, and he was a very careful observer of nature. And that kind of plays into some of the map issues. Early in his Jesuit time with the Jesuits, he was described as exuberantly healthy, big-sized, lusty, proud, impressionable, stubborn, domineering, and hot-tempered. But he was also touted for his excellent ability and his talent for mathematics. Well, that was earlier in his time with the Jesuits. In time, he felt smothered by the strict discipline and self-restraint that was necessary to become a Jesuit. Matter of fact, I always looked at the Jesuits as being the Marine Corps of the Catholic religious orders. It takes something like 13 years or so to become a fully fledged Jesuit, as opposed to some other Catholic religious orders where it's nowhere near that length of time. And at the same time, at the time of LaSalle, there was a debate going on within the order about the role of missionaries. We know that there was Matteo Ricci, who was a Jesuit missionary who went to China and drew maps, and he was able to work his way into the Chinese intelligentsia. So the question was, do we want our missionaries doing that type of work when they encounter new people in new lands? Or do we want them being the humble missionary type that we all know of when we think of somebody like a Father Marquette? Well, the conservative branch won, and they decided to keep the humble missionary type versus the type of one who would become part of the culture of the other group. And all these things combined didn't set well with LaSalle, and he wanted out of the order. And he was relieved of his vows in 1666, but with a touch of class. The Jesuit General Jean-Paul Oliva wrote, "Do you, my very dear brother," speaking of LaSalle, "whenever and whatsoever station of life you be, remember whence you have fallen, and keep in mind the rock from which you have been cut." So that was an interesting way to say goodbye. But LaSalle, it seems after that time, never really had much use or much dealing with the Jesuits. In fact, Jesuit historian Gilbert Garrigan said, "The character of his adventures may be said to furnish the key to all his subsequent career. His need for movement, passion, travel, his faults, and lack of measure." And this comes from his time with the Jesuits. So what do you do now if you're LaSalle? Well, he came to Canada and he sailed there and arrived in 1677. He had a brother who was a Sulpician priest. He had an uncle that was part of the, who had been part of the company of 100 associates. And he first obtained a piece of land near Montreal. So for the next couple of years, it's kind of hard to say what he did, but we know he claimed anyway to have spent several months, probably 7, 8, maybe 9 months with some Iroquois Indians at his residence, where he reportedly learned the Iroquois tongue. He could speak it very well. Matter of fact, one person said that he was claimed to have been proficient in Iroquois. But we found that in 1669, on his first mission west to explore the waterways that flowed to the sea, that he did not know Iroquois at all. When they encountered some Seneca Iroquois in today's upstate New York, during these 2 years, he went west trying to find out about the Ohio River, see if what he can find of where this river flowed. Does it go to the sea, which sea, so on and so forth. But we don't know what he did. We don't know really where he went. Some people have speculated, like Parkman, that he probably made it to Louisville, today's Louisville, Kentucky. Some people have gone so far as to say that he made it to the Mississippi River and carved a stone, the Ellington stone that some farmer found in his field. Some people say that he's even gone beyond that. So we really don't know what he did. It's most of anything beyond this, I believe, is just speculation. But in 1673, then governor of Canada, Count Frontenac, sent him to Cataraqui, which is the mouth of a river on the east side of Lake Ontario. And Cavallier's job was to get the local Iroquois there together for a meeting with Frontenac. Frontenac hoped to negotiate a small piece of land, whereas the future settlement and Fort Frontenac would be built. The Iroquois had other issues to deal with. They weren't so much concerned about this little piece of land. And as a matter of fact, while the negotiations were underway, Frontenac's guys were already clearing brush and stepping out the outline of the walls of the fort. And Fort Frontenac was built. And La Salle was granted a seigneury of Fort Frontenac and the land. He sailed to France and was awarded there a title of nobility, title of lesser nobility. Cavalier is now La Salle, or de La Salle. Keep in mind that La Salle was not a friend of the Indian. We like to think, boy, he's always having these conversations with them. He's trying to do this. He was not a friend of the Indian. He used them, threatened them, cajoled them, or he did whatever he needed to do to get their cooperation. According to Jesuit historian Gilbert Garrigan, again, La Salle was a polyglot. In Jesuit school, he knew Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and according to Garrigan, he even knew Arabic, which is quite amazing. But what's even more amazing is that La Salle made little effort to learn the indigenous languages. For example, when he was en route to the Illinois country in 1679, it wasn't until he reached the St. Joseph River in lower Michigan where he wrote that, you know, it'd be a good thing that he learned some of the language so he can speak with the Indians. He didn't know it. So all these discussions that La Salle was having with all these tribesmen, which include a lot of minute details, he obviously had an interpreter with him. He did not have the ability to speak these languages as he did. So 1678, La Salle is in France again and receives a 5-year license, a royal patent, to explore the western parts of New France, to build forts wherever necessary, probably more so than anything to secure key points, river junctions and things like this. And when he came through the Illinois country the first time, his mission was to locate the mouth of the Mississippi, or locate the Gulf of Mexico via the mouth of the Mississippi. So why is this important? It's important because of the climatic anomalies that were happening at that time. Climatologists call that period the Little Ice Age, 1350-ish to 1850-ish or so. And the coldest part of the Little Ice Age, known as the Maunder Minimum, occurred at the height of French exploration from about 1645 to 1715-ish. Places like Quebec, for example, were frozen over with ice for 4 or 5 months of the year. There was no communication between Quebec and France. So if they could build a fort and a post on the Gulf of Mexico, on the Mississippi and the lower Mississippi, they'd have 12 months a year communication with France. It'd be an easier way to carry the large bison hides that La Salle needed downstream into a waiting port down there, rather than lug them across the Great Lakes and through the rivers to Montreal and Quebec. So it was finding this mouth of the Mississippi was a very important thing to the French. And he was allowed only, as I said, to trade in bison hides. Okay? Keep in mind too that the men with La Salle, 30-some people that came with him from France to Canada, I like to classify them as city boys. They were not rugged outdoorsmen. They were skilled tradesmen, shipbuilders, carpenters, sawyers, and different tradesmen that La Salle hired that he was going to need in the next 5 years to build ships, to build forts, and do things like that. It would be like today, if you were going to go on an expedition to another planet, you're going to need electricians, computer techs, and things like this, which would cost a lot of money to do that. But you have to have these people in order to have a successful enterprise. Let me take a step back here and mention that while returning from 1673 voyage, Louis Joliet, this is in 1674, got in a canoe wreck somewhere near Montreal at the rapids, and he lost everything aboard the canoe. Lost 2 men and a boy in the canoe also, and in that wreck was Marquette's what we call a journal today. It was a relation. It was his annual report that all Jesuits were required to fill out. And in that annual report also required, as DeBlanc called it, a quote, exact chart, an exact map of the countries that were discovered. Well, since he didn't have the map any longer, it was lost in the river, Joliet met with DeBlanc, who was Jesuit superior of Canada, and gave him a verbal account of the Western lands, of the Illinois country, and the Illinois rivers. Okay, and they were quite complimentary. I don't know how this worked or the nuts and bolts about it, but LaSalle had access to this discussion, because if you were to read, for example, in the French Foundation's very first document is the letter to Frontenac, where LaSalle is pointing out point for point for point all the things that Joliet said to DeBlanc and explaining why they are not accurate or just plain wrong. We also know that LaSalle had access to the Franklin 1675 map that was made with information provided by Joliet. So LaSalle actually believed Joliet's report that a bark could navigate, a large commercial vessel could navigate the Illinois River to the Gulf of Mexico, okay? In fact, this is what DeBlanc wrote. The fourth remark concerns a very great and important advantage, which perhaps will hardly be believed. It is that we can go with facility to Florida in a bark and by a very easy navigation. It would be necessary to make a canal by cutting through the half a league of prairie and pass to the foot of the Lake of Illinois to the River St. Louis, or today's Illinois River. So in other words, LaSalle believed that he had the best up-to-date available about those Western lands and Western rivers. In fact, I believe he based his expedition to the Gulf on that information, okay? But he found out soon that what Joliet either told DeBlanc or what DeBlanc's scribe wrote was not exactly the way it was portrayed in the relation. For example, we have here, these are the rapids that mark today's Marseilles, Illinois, on the upper Illinois River. Back in LaSalle's days or Joliet's days, this river was probably half as wide or 2/3 as wide, and it didn't have anywhere near the volume of water because the lock and dam system was created, the Chicago River was reversed, and in 1688, when Henri Joutel traversed these rapids right here, he wrote that these were the roughest rapids that he had to contend with on his trip all the way from Texas all the way to Quebec. If we were to go to a little bit farther downstream, we can see that a bark is not going to make it through this. This is a 1883 map, Army Corps of Engineers map of the Illinois River. Inside the circles here, you can see rapids, you can see sand, you can see rocks. These diagonal lines here, you can't really see them on the map, but these are depth readings. And some of them are 6 inches deep. Some of them are a foot deep. Some are a 1.5 feet deep. Interspersed with rapids and chutes and things like that. So there was no way on earth a barge or a bark, I should say, is going to make it up and down that river right there. As a matter of fact, this was even into the 1890s. They tried to figure out how to get barks from the Mississippi River or from the local communities to Starved Rock to help facilitate tourism there at the new Starved Rock Hotel. Because of these rapids, the Illinois and Michigan Canal was built about a mile north of there that connected the Illinois River at LaSalle, Illinois, with Chicago. So LaSalle had a lot of setbacks to deal with during his first few years of his patent. You lost the bark below Niagara. You lost the bark above Niagara. What history calls the Griffin. He lost in these wrecks. He lost a lot of supplies, a lot of goods, and a wealth in pelts. He had to deal with desertions. When he came to the Illinois country, he had about 33 individuals with him. In a few months, they were down to 6. Then the Iroquois attacked Kaskaskia, the Illinois at Kaskaskia, the people who LaSalle had pinned the hopes of this commercial association with, this commercial alliance with, because the Illinois who lived at Kaskaskia were bison hunters, and there were a lot of them that lived there. And after the attack, the Illinois scattered. Some of them went to probably one of the primary places they went was to their old villages that run the Des Moines River in today's Clark County, Missouri. Then there was the distances he had to travel. It was a long way, 1,300 miles here and 1,200 miles, 500 miles there, and distractions. Frontenac wanted to meet with him in Montreal, so LaSalle had to drop everything and go to Montreal. And guess what? Frontenac never showed up. So all these things combined, he couldn't get very much done. In fact, it wasn't until April of 1682 when he finally got to the mouth of the Mississippi River at the Gulf. With little time left on his patent, he chose to dig in at Starved Rock. So the last couple of days of September 1682, his men began construction of Fort St. Louis on La Roche, or today's Starved Rock. While Fort St. Louis, as I'll call it in English, was under construction, and there's a picture taken from the Starved Rock Visitor Center what the fort probably looked like. LaSalle and his right-hand man, Tonty, convinced these numerous Miami groups and Illinois groups to resettle in Illinois. The Illinois had been chased out of the state. You're trying to get them to come back to the rural village at Kaskaskia. And to protect the colony's safety in numbers, get access to trade goods, LaSalle went to Miami country and convinced numerous bands of Miami to come to the Illinois country. Okay. According to LaSalle, there was 800 to 900 Miami families left their country in 3 groups: the Wea, the Pepacopia, and the Miami proper, and the Killatika came to the Illinois country. Okay. And these settlements of the Miami and the Illinois, they ranged from the Iroquois River, not too far from today's Indiana line, to Bureau County, Illinois, near Princeton, which would be west central Illinois, and scattered throughout there, as we'll see on the map. This was this conglomeration association of tribes where people tend to call LaSalle's colony, Indian colony. Likely after Fort St. Louis had been built on top of the rock, Tonty searched for and found some of these scattered Illinois groups. I'm sure he probably went to the Peoria site, or the Moanguina site on the Des Moines River, and he got them to settle back here. This is the site of Kaskaskia, today known as the Grand Village of the Illinois Historical Site. If you can see back here, this row of trees here on the horizon, Starved Rock or Fort St. Louis would be behind that building right there. Okay, convinced them to return to Kaskaskia. They also convinced some Shawnee, Missouri Indians, a handful of New England tribesmen to also settle into Illinois country. So this was quite a group. Okay. Also realized that the LaSalle of 1678 was not the same LaSalle in 1683. Okay. In 1678, he was pretty cool and calculated. Okay. He had plans, well thought out plans. He had the best of information available to lead an expedition to the Gulf, which including Dablon's report and the 1675 map. He surrounded himself with capable men. He had Henri Tonty, his lieutenant, a person who served in the French Army and Navy, who he needed to move people in groups to be in charge of things when he wasn't around, to pick sites for forts and things like this. He had Jacques Bourdon d'Autrec, who was with LaSalle more than anyone else through thick and thin, and who LaSalle awarded a land grant, the first land grant in today's Illinois. You had Michael Acko, who was LaSalle's bison hide trader. He was at the cutting edge of the bison business. He had traded before LaSalle got his patent in 1678. He had been trading with the tribes in today's Iowa and Missouri, probably along the Des Moines River there. So he had capable men around him. LaSalle even forgave deserters when LaSalle's boat, the Griffin, they ended up, or it finally arrived at Mackinac. They found that a lot of the guys took off with the goods, and they caught several of them, and some of them were brought back in the fold and were forgiven. But combine these assertions and Indian attacks, the distances, and so on and so forth, he just didn't have enough time to establish that post on the Gulf. It's May of 1683, his patent was expired and he needed more time. He was deep in debt. If he couldn't get a renewal on that patent, how's he going to pay these people back? He owed them a lot of money. He was essentially rattled. Okay. He had no way to pay his creditors, and he was very prone to hyperbole. Again, 1678, he was rather cool and calculated, but now his patent's done. Now what does he do? And these things are reflected in his writings and what he did next. So with his patent expired, LaSalle was unable to provide the trade goods to the tribes that had been promised to them. Okay, he had to leave. He stayed until late August-ish, early September-ish, when there was nothing more he could do. So he left and sailed to France, and he had to get that extension on his patent. This was a lot more important than just say, boy, I got this patent. This would be wonderful. No, his future depended on this. So he left the fort. This picture was taken on top of Starved Rock at the fort. And if you can see this area right in through here, that's the Grand Village of the Illinois. That's where the Kaskaskia village, where the Illinois Indians would have lived. So LaSalle's in France. So he meets the French minister, Seignelay, and he's going to have to convince him of several things. He's going to have to put his best foot forward to the minister, and he's going to have to explain why he needs this extension on his patent. Now, remember too, it's at the same time LeBar is now the governor of Canada, and he was ordered to consolidate New France's population. For LaSalle to go and to continue this exploration and separating himself and other Frenchmen from the Quebec area, Lower St. Lawrence, was contrary to everything that the Crown was trying to do in Canada. So LaSalle tried to put the best case he could make, whether it was true or not. And he told the ministers that the Mississippi was navigable for ocean-going ships. Ships' hulls could be built from the region's timber. And that's if you can wade through the swamps to get it. The material for rope and rigging was abundant. That iron mines might be found to make tools and cannons, which is nice. Maybe they can find gold too while they're at it. That the climate was pleasant and the natural resources were plentiful and cheap. Well, he was in the lower Mississippi in in April. So yeah, I imagine that the climate was pretty pleasant, but if he would have been in the same place in August, I wonder if he would have had the same impressions. And here's a really good one too, that the domestic animals were abundant in every part of the country. I'm not quite sure where the cows, pigs, goats, and horses came from down there, but LaSalle tried to convince the minister that they were there. And as icing on the cake, France being essentially a church state, the Indians were more inclined to Christianity than other tribes. So this was basically part of the package that LaSalle tried to sell to the minister. And the map is also part of that package. So let me give you a caveat. First of all, I am not saying, I'm not saying that this map is a forgery or part of a conspiracy or anything like that, okay? I'm not saying that the names of the tribes or locations of the settlements that are depicted on the map are not accurate. What I am stating is that before we assume what researchers have concluded to be true, the numbers of people that live there, the number of total Indians in the entire quote colony, and the location, before we have got before we can assume that this is true, as we have, a lot of people have, a lot of problems need to be addressed. Okay, LaSalle's got some splaining to do, as we say. Okay, so it's in 1684 that Franklin draws this carte de Louisiane, this map, which is part of the package that LaSalle is going to give to petition to the minister. All the information on this map, or I should say as it applies to the Illinois country and the Great Lakes, is based on information supplied by LaSalle. The map is supposed to be lands and waterways traversed by LaSalle between 1679 and 1682, which can't be true because, as we saw, the map had the East Coast. It had a lot of areas in the West where LaSalle had never been. Okay, and its map also includes LaSalle's so-called Indian colony, that area inside that red circle. Now, about the map, a lot of researchers have included, myself, I was one of them, based on the Jesuit formula for determining populations for native groups, from the numbers on the maps, that about, or maybe even over, 20,000 Native Americans lived in this colony, in this settlement area. And we're going to talk about that Jesuit formula in a minute. Okay. But we have to ask, is 20,000 an accurate number? Is this number even realistic? As my family and friends in northern Minnesota would say, let's scope it out, eh? Okay. First of all, we know the map that we have today is not the original. It's a 19th century copy. We know that the famous historian Francis Parkman sailed to France while he was researching his discovery, LaSalle and the discovery of the West in the 1860s. That's a picture of Mr. Parkman right there. And while he was there, he met Pierre Margry, whose famous 6 volumes Discoveries was published. And the two met, and there's a picture of Margry, and discussed. This is when that current map was drawn. The original map is gone. We don't know where it's at. I'm not saying it's a conspiracy or anything like that. It's just, it's gone. Okay. So this map that we're dealing with is not the original map to begin with. And keep in mind that both Parkman and Margry were staunch fans of LaSalle. LaSalle was their great man, the kind of way history was written back in that period in the 19th century. So we ask again, is it possible that the copyists made mistakes? They embellished some of this info? They omit info? Was he biased towards LaSalle? And we know from the scribal classes, even in the Middle Ages, they made all kinds of mistakes because before the printing press, people had to write things down. So we're, in that same note, is that map accurate? Are there any problems with it? Okay. So let's look at the tribal populations on the map, and we're also going to review LaSalle's written statements. The 20,000 number, most cited by historians, is based on the following assumptions. Number one family of Illinois or Miami equals 1 hunter and 4 non-hunter warriors, 5 people. Yes, it could be 2 people. Yes, it could be 9 people. But as a general kind of average, we just call it 5 per family. Each fire had 2 families or 10 people. 2 families, 10 people, 1 cabin, 1 hut, 1 residence equals 2 fires, 4 families, 4 hunter warriors, 16 non-hunter warriors for a total of 20 people. So rather than when the missionaries came to the Indian villages like Kaskaskia, didn't say, okay, I need everybody to get in a long line, start counting 1, 2, 3. They didn't count them like that. They counted lodges. So for every lodge, there's 20 people. So we know, like when Marquette and Joliet had visited Kaskaskia in 1673, Marquette counted 74 cabins or huts, which would translate to 1,480 people, give or take 100 or so. So they had a rough idea. These villages on the map have population designations. Some of the numbers include an H behind the number. right? The past assumption is H means men or hunter warriors, okay? And if we tally all these numbers up and divide it by 5, then we have the, actual numbers of hunter warriors and populations. The Miami groups with populations numbers that include that letter H include the Miami proper, as LaSalle called them, Todiching in his words, 1300H, Kilatika, 300H, the Wea, 500H, the Pepecoquia, 160H. But there are also a lot of villages on that map that do not have an H next to their corresponding population number. Piankashaw, 150, the Illinois subtribes at Kaskaskia, 1200, the Wabana, 70. Now keep in mind too, that these Miami tribes, these different subtribes, seem to all be living in their own villages at different locations, as opposed to the Illinois subtribes at Kaskaskia are a bunch of different Illinois subtribes that are living together at one village. So it seems there's a different demographic as we look at the map as well. So if we add all these village populations together, assuming that those numbers are H or no H and represent men or hunter warriors, yeah, that would make over 20,000 Indians in the colony, okay? If the previous assumption are the same, whether or not there's an H or not, then we ask, what was the purpose of the H? To that answer, I don't think there's really any good questions, or that question, I don't think there's any good answers. That's better. So if the 20,000 is correct, then, all right, if that number is correct, then 12,050 of the 20,000 would have been Miami, 6,000 Illinois, 3,500 Shawnee, and 350 Wabana. In other words, the Miami alone would have comprised 55% of the colony. And I guess the way I understand this, and most people did, was the Miami, even though they were bison hunters, the Illinois bison hunters were the served a primary role in the Miami, and the others were safety in numbers, sort of. Yes, they did hunt. Yes, they would trade and stuff, but 12,050, 55% would be just the backup people, okay? And in my way of looking at it, that's an awful lot of Miami for that time. And keep in mind, these numbers do not include the Miami who may have remained in Indiana or Michigan that were still friendly to the Iroquois, because some of them were, or the Miami that probably still lived in Wisconsin at the St. Jacques Mission on the Rock River near today's Berlin. Because remember in 1680, the Miami chief Moonswa, the deer, came there with a group of his, with other Miamis that came to the Illinois village at Lake Peoria to try to turn those Illinois away from LaSalle. So we know there was probably some Miami living there as well. So this is an awful lot of Miami if that map is accurate. So we ask, could this number designate something else? Could that number, besides each settlement, could it be habitats, total village population? Could it maybe be huts, as if it was anglicized by Parkman's copies? So now let's look at some issues. Okay. LaSalle's, and this is where it's irreconcilable. Okay, LaSalle's own statements contradict the information on his map, and LaSalle's own statements come shortly before the time that map was drawn. Okay, from 1683, late 1682-ish or so. Okay, so let's look at a few of these. LaSalle, as we saw earlier, wrote that between 800 and 900 families of Miami marched from their Indiana villages to their new Illinois country settlements. He wrote that to LaBarre, okay, to Governor Barr. That means that a total of between 4,000 and 4,500 Miami, it would have occupied between 200 and 225 villages, relocated to the Illinois country. Now, if that was it, that is significantly less than the total of 12,050 if the Miami populations and all groups were added together. In another correspondence, LaSalle wrote that the Missouri Indians and 4 sub-tribes of Miami, Piankashaw, Kilatika, and 2 others also moved to the colony, right? they reportedly number between 200 and 300 fires, or between 2,000 and 3,000 people. Okay. One problem is that these two sub-tribes here are not depicted on the map at all. So where are they? Well, are they living with the other sub-tribes? Well, maybe they have, but it seems like all the other Miami sub-tribes are living in their own groups. Using LaSalle statements as a guide, it's 800 and 900 and between the 200 and 300 fires. If we add all those numbers together, we still would only have between 6,000 and 7,500 total Miamis. According to the map, the Ouiatenon village, the Ouias, was located on the north side of the Illinois River, probably on Bureau Creek in today's Bureau County, north of the Big Bend, north of Hennepin. Okay. LaSalle reported that they settled to the number of 35 huts, which would be 700 people. That's in Margrave, but if you read the Indian Claims Commission, it's 250 huts. Okay. Now this part here is where we might be able to get a little clarity on some of these numbers. But if H is assumed to be hunter warriors, that meant 2,500 would have relocated to LaSalle's colony. Okay. The map shows 500 H. Does this mean that that 500 represents inhabitants of the village and not hunter warriors? If it does, just think about it, because if we're going to use the hunter warrior, the 1/5, if we take all that number, 35, and add, we would have 2,500 people. But if we just went by village inhabitants, we would have 500 people, which is a lot closer to 700 than 2,500. So in this case here, just one example here, it appears that LaSalle is not talking about hunter warriors. He seems to be talking about the total population that lived there. And as you can see, this is where the village is right here, and this would be the Big Bend of the Illinois River. The Miami, as LaSalle wrote it proper, the Crane clan, number depicted on the Parkman map is 1,300 H. Assuming that 1,300 H represents total population, the total population of that group living on the Iroquois River would have been 1,300, which is reasonable for a large subtribe. For example, the large Kaskaskia subtribe of the Illinois in 1673 were 1,480 people. Okay. If the 1,300 H represents just hunter warriors, the population of that Miami subtribe, just that one subtribe, just in that one spot, would have been 6,500 more. That's more than the entire number of colony Illinois Indians. Of all those Illinois groups that came back to Kaskaskia, that one subtribe would have had more people than all the Illinois who served the primary role. I don't think this is a realistic number, 6,500 for one single Miami tribe. Then I could be wrong. So if 1,300 people, it was 1,300 people in that subtribe, that would reduce that 20,000 number by 4,200, or now we're down to 15,800, and we're just dealing with this one single subtribe. And this is where they lived according to the map. Excuse me. LaSalle wrote to the governor, LaBarre, that the Missouri, Piankashaw, Kilataka, and the other two lived in a single village numbering between 2,000 and 3,000 people. And we saw that the last two weren't anywhere to be found, and that they have made their fields roughly 4 leagues from the fort on Starved Rock, 11 miles-ish, somewhere there. Okay. 2,000 to 3,000 seems reasonable, considering that LaSalle wrote that 800, 900 families, between 400 and 4,500 people occupying between 200 and 224 cabins related to Illinois. Again, but according to the map, 150 Piankashaw with no age are depicted living in their own village 44 miles east of LaSalle's fort at the forks of the Des Plaines and Kankakee River, not 11 miles away. And I'll show you this on a map in a little bit. Matter of fact, I'll show you right now. Here's the map. Here's around 11 miles here. This is where the Piankashaw are living here. This is the Forks. Okay. Problem 2. The map shows the Killatika living in their own village south of the Big Bend near Hennepin, approximately 24 miles west of the fort near Hennepin. Now, this is where these Indians are supposedly living when LaSalle left and how the information on the map was drawn. Okay. Problem number 3, the Missouri village, which we'll talk about these Missouri in a little bit, is located somewhere near today's Princeton, at least 30 miles northwest of the fort. So there's 75 miles difference between site of the Missouri village from the Piankashaw village. That's quite a large, that's a lot larger than 11 miles or so, okay? The only Miami settlement within 11 miles of Starved Rock at that time was 160 Pepacokia near Ottawa, a village consisting of either 160 people or 800 people if we count hunter warriors. It's nowhere near the 2,000 to 3,000. And we know that these tribes moved around. It wasn't that they moved at that spot, with the exception of the Illinois. These Miami groups moved around. For example, if you were to look at Franklin's 1688 map, you'll see that, okay, this tribe, sub-tribe is now living over here, and this tribe, sub-tribes live here. These sub-tribes aren't even there anymore. We know between 1688 and 1687 and 1680, some Miami were living on top of Buffalo Rock. Probably to intimidate the Illinois who lived right below the rock. So we know these Miami groups were moving around, but we're talking with the information that LaSalle had when he left the Illinois country and the map was drawn. So here we got the Piankashaw here, the Killatika here, we got the Wabana here, and this was where the fort's at. Inconsistency. Now, Parkman's map also has 1,200 Illinois, no age, living at Kaskaskia. If that number represents hunter warriors, the village population would have been approximately 6,000 people. Now, coincidentally, Tonti wrote that the Illinois established themselves at Kaskaskia to the number of 300 cabins or 6,000 people. So if we use that formula, that 5 to 1 or 4 to 1 formula, then Tonti's numbers and the map match up. 6,000 people of all the different subtribes is a reasonable number. But LaSalle wrote that the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Moanguina, Caporo, and several others of these tribes, including the Cahokia, Tamaroa, and Minchinkoa, were moving to his colony. They were coming to his colony. They're going to resettle in his colony. But LaSalle also wrote that there were 300 huts of Tamaroa. Tamaroa is a sub-tribe, probably not one of the larger sub-tribes. We're moving to his colony or at the colony. At 6,000 of them alone had moved to his colony. And no, he's not saying that, oh, all these Illinois sub-tribes are included in the Tamaroa. No, because when LaSalle wrote this, he wrote all these other sub-tribes, and then he says the Tamaroa. So 6,000 Tamaroa alone had moved to his colony? No. And making matters worse is a couple of years earlier, the Tamaroa lost 700 people of their people to the Iroquois. Okay, when they were passed, when the Iroquois attacked Kaskaskia on their way back home. I find it hard to believe that there ever were 6,000 Tamaroa. Then there's the problem with LaSalle's Minchinkoa. He wrote that they had formerly lived about 30 leagues, 90 miles, 80 miles from Fort St. Louis. And he wrote that 300 fires of them, or about 3,000 Minchinkoas, were moving to his colony. They are packing up and they are moving to his colony. Well, if we were to add these two sub-tribes, in Minchinkoa, they disappeared into history. So I don't know how big they ever would have been in the first place. The two numbers that LaSalle puts out would be 9,000 people. Now, if we were to add the Peoria, which was probably the largest of the Illinois subgroups, they even had 2 villages, the Kaskaskia, Cahokia, and other large Illinois subtribes, the population, LaSalle's population at Kaskaskia would have been well over 20,000 alone. This is completely different than the information on this map. As we see, Illinois, 1200 right here. LaSalle wrote that the Cahokia, Tamaroa, Peoria, and others returned to Kaskaskia. These tribes, sub-tribes are in the group that are relocating. The problem is, as we shall see, is that the 1684 map that was drawn just shortly after LaSalle left depicts the Cahokia and Tamaroa living in southern Illinois and not at the colony. These 4 Illinois sub-tribes, especially the Peoria, the largest sub, are living west of the Mississippi in today's Iowa. So did they live west of Kaskaskia, or live at Kaskaskia, or west of the Mississippi? Did some of the Peoria, who during historic times seemed to live in 2 different villages, did one of the villages stay west of the Mississippi and the other village came to the Illinois country? Did both of them come to the Illinois country? Both of them stay in the Illinois country? What happened? Okay, if they stayed at Kaskaskia, why didn't LaSalle, why did he locate these tribes west of the Mississippi? So we have, here's LaSalle's colony and where the Illinois are living, but here you can see these Illinois tribes, the Peoria, Moline, living here. This would be today's Iowa, Missouri. And then we can see the Cahokia and Tamaroa living down here in southern Illinois. Okay. And mysteriously missing from the map are these many New England tribes that were supposedly allied with LaSalle. Maybe somebody else can find this. I haven't been able to find too much in reference to them, but the only real for sure thing I could find was, this is a letter in a 1684 document when Fort St. Louis was surrounded by the Iroquois for 6 days, where Bogie, the commandant at the fort, writes that inside the fort were 9 Loups or Mohicans, 24 French, 9 Mohicans, 8 Miamis, 5 Shawnees. So this is the only of these New England people we can find. There's a couple of interesting tidbits where I read. LaSalle wrote that the, quote, Missouri Indians moved to his colonies. However, no Missouri Indians villages are depicted on the map. But there is this Wabana village in Bureau County. So who are the Wabana? What can we know about them? Well, Hodges' Handbook of Indians North of Mexico, volume 15, really confuses the issue by stating they were Abenaki from the east. The Abenaki lived in the lower St. Lawrence River area. And he wrote that they appear to have come from the south and traded with the Spaniards, which is really the complete opposite. So as my friends in my old neighborhood would say in Chicago, where I grew up, hey, who are these guys anyway? Huh? Well, fortunately, my colleague, friend, and mentor, Michael McCafferty from Indiana University, a linguist who had been studying Miami, Illinois languages for over 40 years, might have give us a real decent explanation for this. He says, first of all, the term Wabana is not Miami, Illinois at all, as are several names of places in Illinois that were named in actually Ojibwa and Odawa and not in Illinois. He wrote that the name does suggest the Miami, Illinois term for possibly the Odo, which would have been Washuna, which would have been written by as Wachona by any commonly educated Frenchman at the time, such as Franklin. CH mistaken for a B is quite possible. The Wabana, this mystery tribe, seems most likely to be today's Odo, Missouri tribe, a trans-Mississippi tribe. We know that LaSalle's bison hide trader, Michael Acko, had traded with the Odo before 1678. He was at the cutting edge of the bison business before LaSalle even had his 5-year patent. We know he was there. Occult was said to have known the Chewier language, the language. How would he know this language unless he had been in their country and spoke with them, or the Little Prairie Sioux, or the Iowas? And strangely enough, if you look at LaSalle at his time at Fort Crevecoeur in 1680, mysteriously out of nowhere, this Odo delegation visited LaSalle at the fort in 1680, leaving their territory and coming way into the Illinois country to meet LaSalle. Hennepin, Acko, and Agawam, they were sent up to the Mississippi. Tonti says specifically that they were sent north up the Mississippi. Why did they go with a load of trade goods? They went with a load of trade goods because they're probably going back to this Odo village to reestablish trade ties that Echo once had with them. Okay. And what's just cool about this is it shows that LaSalle hoped to funnel these bison hides down the Mississippi, from the Illinois country down the Illinois River to the Mississippi, and from the Western tribes, Western bison hunting tribes like the Odo down the Mississippi, where they would funnel into it. Okay. And that's the Odo village on Marquette's map in Tanta there. LaSalle told the French minister to 18,000 Indians settled in his old colony that he could muster about 3,600 warriors to defend lower Louisiana. Well, yeah, on paper, yes, but the problem is just because he could muster 3,600 people don't mean that 3,600 people are actually going to join the fight. Remember when Tonti in 1687 went to fight the Iroquois, he had to get as many Illinois and Miami together as he could to go fight the Iroquois. Okay, he got a handful of them, 150 or something like that, even though there would have been 3,600 there to defend, living there at the time. So just because on paper you have it doesn't mean they're going to join. And putting it in perspective, that 3,600, if that's accurate, would have outnumbered Denonville's army in 1687 anyway. You got to remember that LaSalle controlled all the information concerning the activities in the West. His enemies at Quebec could accuse him of many things, starting an invisible empire, doing all these things, this fantastical empire, and he's doing these things, but they could not dispute his numbers. Okay, LaSalle had a monopoly. So as we look at this, did 20,000 Indians really live in LaSalle's colony? Well, perhaps, maybe not. I'm not very dogmatic about it. Did LaSalle embellish his numbers in an attempt to convince the Crown to extend his patent? Perhaps, maybe not. But given such contradictory and inconsistent information from which to draw population estimates, I believe it's impossible to accurately determine how many Indians lived in LaSalle Colony in 1683. And with that, I thank you.
Mark, thank you very much. There have been quite a few comments in the chat over the course of your presentation. One of them, which I also find very fascinating, is that you showed early on to accompany your presentation some later paintings imagining what LaSalle's voyages might have looked like. But they are, as a couple of people have pointed out in the chat, they are not exactly accurate because they probably are including elements that would not have existed at LaSalle during LaSalle's time, such as the HBC flag in the back of a canoe, or Patrick has pointed out that one of the paintings is a canot de maître from the late 18th century and not of LaSalle's time. But
that's correct. There's a lot of pictures in here. For example, the picture right at Bureau Creek, that's a picture of Indian Creek north of my house because I couldn't get the Bureau Creek to get a picture. So what I did is essentially, that's a Frances Ann Hopkins painting from the Upper Great Lakes. And one way you can tell is you always see a picture. She always puts herself in the canoe. So a lot of those pictures are not accurate, but they're just visual aids. I guess I could put all text up, but at least you get a look at a few things. Yeah, that is correct. A lot of those things, several of them are not exactly accurate.
And another question was, you mentioned the New England tribes that LaSalle addressed in his communications. Do you know did he ever specify which tribes?
He did, but I'd be hard pressed to try to spit out the names. If you go to his, like in Anderson, LaSalle's relation between 1678 and 1681, he specifically names them out. Matter of fact, he had an interpreter. One of his Indians that worked for him. It was an interpreter, and he mentioned those New England tribes. And the reason why they found themselves in southern Michigan was because not only they were afraid with the Iroquois, but the British settlers were basically forcing them out and taking their land. So when they came to Michigan, they asked for LaSalle's help. What can we do? What's in store for us? And if LaSalle didn't satisfy them, then they actually considered going back and just siding with the Iroquois. So as fact, I mean, I could look it up for you, but yeah, there were a number of these different groups.
All right, thank you. And thanks to people who've been adding to the chat. I think that whole question of what the H stand for, somebody had put in the chat that it could be habitant just before you actually started mentioning that yourself, Mark. If there aren't any other questions in the chat, I'd like to thank Mark again for a fascinating presentation on a subject I know he's very passionate about. What we will do, it is 2:02